Hello everyone and welcome to His Author's Voice. And I am the author, Jack Sanger. I was born in India. Beside my bed, as I sleep these days, is a small carved dragon table, my only heirloom of that time. I touch it some nights and remember crawling beside it when I was young. Perhaps this tale was born out of my tactile caress with my past. The food of love. In a time and a place that were recorded in tales around fires was born a boy whose name at birth we do not know. It was an unending time of unrest and division, where gangs of mountain people took clubs and spears against their neighbours to steal food, goats, and young women. The boy joined in the raiding parties when he showed the first signs of manhood. In every way he was like any other young man, herding his goats, hunting and trapping animals for food, foraging for herbs, roots, leaves, and grasses. And then one day, when he was named, and his voice had settled into its new path, he had a dream. In the dream, a spirit, in the form of a waterfall sprite, whispered instructions in his ear. He followed the gentle creature's instructions. He climbed the white-topped mountain where all dreams become real. Here he made a lute out of jackwood, assorted pieces of maple, and the skin and gut of a mountain goat. He took his lute to the great waterfall, whose spray, bathed by the sun, contained all the known colours and many that the eye could not see, and in whose torrent were all the sounds the ear could hear, and many that could not be heard. He climbed the waterfall and entered the concealed cave behind it. He hid the lute there on a natural shelf and returned to his people. Here the lute absorbed the wonders of the waterfall through all its seasons. A full year later, according to the spirit's instructions, he returned for the lute. It was ready. It was full of the sounds and colours of the waterfall. He took it to the green pasture land in the valley. Here he sat under an ancient mother tree. He first tuned the lute to the perfect notes that trilled from the throats of rising birds. Then his fingers pressed and plucked the strings to copy the poetry of the waterfall, the deep rumbling, the soft moaning, the high tinkling laughter of its continuous conversation with the mountain and the sky. Days came and went. His people brought him food and drink, but otherwise left him in solitude, in reverence, knowing that he was being spirit-led. When he was ready, his lute, fingers, heart, and mind in harmony, he returned to his people. The first night of his return, his people sat around him beside the fire and waited. The men held spears, the women their short cooking knives, because at such times they had often been attacked by neighbours. They stared entranced at the strange thing that the young man had made on the mountain, and which rested on his knee. Their faces took on a show of bliss as his fingers began to pluck the strings of the lute, and the sounds of birds and insects and wind and waterfall filled the air. They closed their eyes and drifted away on dreams of happiness. Spears and knives fell to the ground. That night his people slept peacefully, some for the first time since they were babes on their mother's breasts. Their dreams were not of battles and the fear of death, but of the sun and the sky and the bounties of the earth. Each night he played for them. Gradually they stopped their raiding parties, but merely strengthened their defences against attack. Surprisingly, these attacks also grew less. One day the young man took his lute to the same mother tree to play for himself. The birds gathered in the branches, the wind whispered a warm, soft breath, and little creatures buzzed and clicked by his feet. The lute player was lost in the music of his fingers and did not sense the approach of another. Nor did he notice that she stood swaying just paces away from him and had entered a reverie much as he had. It was his fingers that told him. They moved higher and higher up the neck of the strings, so that the lute now stood on end, higher than his head. His eyes opened, and at the same moment her eyes opened, and they saw each other. Yet his fingers did not falter, but played on, high, cascading notes in a joyful, repeated rhythm, and she swayed in her indigo robes to the beat, and her feet moved in circles, softly caressing the ground. She spun slowly around him and the old tree, coming and going into and out of sight. Each time she emerged, it was for their eyes to lock. It was now that a further magical transformation took place. He began to sing. The song that left his lips spoke of now, this very meeting, this encounter with the young woman from the nearby tribe under the shelter of the mother tree. They both heard the words as they left his lips and marvelled at their mysterious birth. I played upon my lute, and a woman in indigo came to me, hearing the melodies. She danced around my lute and the mother tree, and the air was sweet between her and me. He sang it again and again, and the young woman, still swirling around him, joined in to sing the last line, her soft high voice complementing his own. He didn't want to finish, fearing that on the last note she would be gone. But finish he must, for his fingers were sore. He stood up, tall, lightly bearded, in the red robes of his people, and saw her fully for the first time. She too was tall, her hair braided and long, dressed in the colour of her people. "What is your name?" she asked boldly. "My people now call me Bumjala, earth and water." "My people now call me Agnivata, air and fire." "So together we make the eternal cross," she smiled, crossing her arms in front of her. He instantly followed suit. Then they bowed to each other. "Let us bring our peoples here with meat and drink under tomorrow's sun, and you will play your lute and I will dance, and we will teach them to sing our song together." She reached forward a hand, and their fingers touched, and she was gone. Bumjala persuaded his people that there would be no ambush if they joined with their neighbours in food and drink, to listen to the sorcery of his lute and to see a young woman dancing. Agnivata was daughter of her people's chief, and so she also persuaded her people to come to the gathering with meat and drink. the neighbouring peoples came together bearing food and drink, and spears and knives. But Agnivata took her spear and knife and pressed them into the earth. Opposite her, Bumjala did the same. Then he stepped in front of his weapons and took the flute in his hands, while she stepped in front of her weapons and stood waiting. They bowed to each other. Then he began to play and she to dance, and the thrilling sounds of the lute and the glory of her movement were unlike anything their peoples had ever encountered. One by one, they struck their weapons into the ground and began stamping their feet and clapping their hands. At last, Bumjala broke into song, their song. Agnivata joined him on the last line. Their peoples listened and understood. After the fourth repetition, they began to join with them, and the song swelled and echoed under the old mother tree and across the mountain. Soon all were singing. Men, women, and children were dancing, singing, and clapping, first only with their own kind, but then with their neighbours. Later, a fire was lit, and they shared bread, meat, and drink together. Girls and boys in indigo and red were seen mingling together, playing, touching, laughing. When all were quiet and content, lying around the great fire, Bumjala began a new song, and found the words springing of their own accord from his lips. But this time, every alternate line was sung by Agnivata. Soon everyone joined them. I played upon my lute under the old mother tree. Neighbours came with meat and wine to eat and drink with thee. We put aside the old ways of hate and fear and bloody days, and this gave time for peace to grow, and evermore will it be so. And evermore will it be so. Bumjala and Agnivata embraced in front of their peoples. There were cheers and clapping. Then after they kissed, a young woman in an indigo robe came up to them. In a loud, clear voice that carried to the furthest listener, she asked, "Will you make me a lute of peace?" "Of course," Bumjala smiled. "Of course." Well, that was The Food of Love. I hope you enjoyed it. In these times of unrest and man's inhumanity to man, I found myself withdrawing into a writing bubble in which such awfulness was banished. Afterwards, having written this story, I felt what might be termed the joy of catharsis. Anyway, there is a wide range of stories on this channel, all original and with twist endings. Please listen and subscribe by clicking on the subscriber button. If you prefer to read my stories, you can go to my website, which is www.jacksanger.com, and there you will find novels, plays and short stories and some poetry. You can download for free or make a donation. It's entirely up to you. In the meantime, go in peace. Bye-bye.